so any requests for Shlema or for your sites or anything, guys? Anything? Okay, so refer Shlema for all the who require it.
I wish you bandwidth. Where are you?
Yeah, can't hear you. I thought it was my machine.
Is Tisha B'Av. So from this Saturday night, Friday night actually is the 3 weeks because it's Friday is Rosh Chodesh. So just a couple of halachot on the 3 weeks. Basically, what restrictions are saying Shechianu, shaving. But shaving is an interesting one. Some people hold only the week of Tisha B'Av, the week like from the Shabbos to Tisha B'Av. So this year it's actually like only one day. It's like the Motzei Shabbos to Tisha B'Av. Some people hold, that's what they hold by. Listening to music, even recorded music, getting married, moving into a new home or apartment, whether owning or renting during the 3 weeks, one shouldn't do. I mean, if you have to, if you have no option, I'm sure it says it is, if necessary, it is permitted, but one should avoid it. If you're swimming now, it actually mentions swimming a couple of times in terms of pleasure. It should be avoided during the 3 weeks because bad things have happened to our people during this time throughout history. And it says also here, you may be permitted to swim during the 9 days if you consult a rov to see what the purpose is. Now here in Israel, it's not exactly cool weather. I just came back from a run. I left at 5:30 because it was cooler, and I'd love to go into a pool. So they say pools, swimming at the beach, one should avoid. I mean, as long as if you're with people, and not on your own, maybe that's ideal if you want to have like a little dip. But don't spend too much time. And just one other thing. Okay, so like fun stuff, like going to nightclubs and place where there's like live music and probably the theater, that should be avoided. You're supposed to reduce your joy because it's a sad period culminating in the destruction of the first and second temples and the start of the Shoah. And I think the First and Second World Wars, a lot of bad things happened, and Jewish people were affected by it.
Evan, if you want to reduce your joy, come work in the hospital. There's no joy here.
Absolutely. No, Arthur, and I'll tell you the one, I think it was in Shabbos. It was the weirdest thing. Where was I? I saw like 2-3 people, like you get these people in a wheelchair and they're totally lifeless and they need a metapillet, and the guy, they wear this like neck brace, they can't do a thing for themselves. And you see like young people, you sometimes see teenagers and you think, geez, thank God I'm not like that. A person like that can't, for the rest, they've got their whole life ahead of them, however many years they live. And we complain. I mean, we have difficulties, but geez, I saw 3 of those people in one day. It was very weird. Anyway.
Well, I got a new client. He's 58 years old. He has a rare genetic disorder that is inherited in his family. At this stage, it started about 20-something years ago. He's like losing mobility in his body. Like he can't lift himself up properly. I have to help him. He's 58. 58.
Jeez.
I have to shower him. I have to wash him. He has to hold on. To get to the bathroom, he has to hold on the back of a wheeling chair. Wheeled like a strolling chair so he can keep his balance.
Sure.
That's scary what people go through. We don't have much. We always complain about our problems until you get involved in caregiving. You realize, wow, there's a lot of people.
You see it, Jesus. Unbelievable.
I see sometimes I have PTSD from it. Like it gets to me. It's very emotional. Yeah. No, look, when I see somebody who's in their 90s, okay, that's fine. When I see somebody young, man, it's not nice.
Shame, man. Before I send the link, I just wanted to tell you the calamities. So it started off, as you know, guys, with the 12 spies sent by Moshe to observe the land of Canaan, and they returned from the mission, and only 2 of the spies, you had Caleb and Yeshua, that brought a positive report, but the others spoke disparagingly about the land. So the majority report actually caused the children of Bnei Israel to cry, panic, despair, etc., of ever entering the promised land, so that they were punished by God for their generation would not enter the land. So the Midrash quotes Shem as saying about this event, you cried before me pointlessly, I will fix for you this day as a day of crying for all the generations. Obviously alluding to the future misfortunes. What happened is everybody, every year on Tisha B'Av, Arthur, had to dig a grave. And some people would walk out of it the next at the end
in the desert, while they were in the desert for 40 years.
In the desert while they were in the, and some people didn't, but they had their graves made in case they didn't come out. So it saved a lot of work. Now,
So this is like going surfing during the time.
Pardon?
Don't go surfing in Durban during this time.
Yeah. But I'm having a serious discussion with you in terms of what they did. Anyway, it's lost. So
No, it's serious. I know. I mean, I can't imagine digging a grave for myself, and even digging a grave and getting inside the mental turmoil you must go through.
So then, obviously, the first temple built by King Solomon was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. That was in about 586 BCE. And then the population of the kingdom of Yehuda was sent into the Babylonian exile. The first destruction began on the 7th of Av. Okay, and it continued until the 10th of Av. Therefore, a lot of people don't have meat until the 10th of Av because there was still continued to
from the 9th of Av, from the 9 days. You mean? Yeah, started the 9 days.
But I'm
except
saying
Shabbos.
What happened there is it was still smoldering on the 10th, so some people don't.
Till midday. Till midday on the 10th.
Exactly. And the second temple built by Ezra, and Nehemiah was destroyed by the Romans in 70 CE. So that scattered the people of Judea and commencing the Jewish exile from the Holy Land. That was the end of that. Then you had in 135 CE Bar Kokhba's revolt and destroyed the city of Beitar. There were over 500,000 or 580,000 civilians that were killed. Okay. Then following that revolt, there was Quintus Taninus Rufus, and he plowed the site of the temple in Jerusalem and the surrounding area. Then you had the First Crusade. So that started started on the 15th of August, 1096. Okay, on the 24th of Av, that killed 10,000 Jews. That started every sort of pogrom. Then the Jews were expelled from England in 1290 on the 18th of July. Then on the 22nd of July in 1306, they were expelled from France. Then in 1492, apart from the Spanish Inquisitions, they were expelled from Spain on the 7th.
And Portugal, isn't it?
No, they're just from Spain. The Spanish Inquisition did occur in Portugal. Every nation took their turn with glee. But some of these were on the 9th and 10th of Av. The expulsion from Spain, excuse the pun, were on the 7th of Av, which was probably good in a way because then we weren't liable to the same sort of inquisition to convert. Then you had Heinrich Himmler on the 9th of Av, August the 2nd, 1941. That whole issue received approval from the Nazi Party for the final solution.
Yeah.
Then in July the 23rd, 1942, which was the 9th of Av, that was the mass deportation of Jews from Warsaw en route to Treblinka. And then the AMIA bombing of the Jewish community in Buenos Aires killed 85 people, injured 300.
1994,
1994, that's exactly. That was on the 10th of on Saturday night, that the rabbis taught in the Brisa that we may not raise small domesticated animals in the land of Israel, but we may raise them in the forests that are in the land of Israel. In Syria, even in a settled area, Syria was in question because it became part of Eretz Israel. But we said David HaMelech was a personal conquest for him. So it wasn't considered a national biblical land of Israel. It was more a personal campaign that he ran, and therefore didn't have the same level of Kedusha. And it's unnecessary to say that we may raise them in foreign lands. Obviously, if they're non-Jews as neighbors, there's no issue. So if you happen to live in a Jewish community overseas, the damage you cause to your Jewish neighbors, you would reimburse them financially. I mean, that's also given. So it was taught in another brisa, you may not raise small domesticated animals in the land of Israel, but we may raise them in the Judean desert and in the Akka border wilderness. Kevin quite rightly said that the Akka border is in the north, in the coastal area. It must be not quite the coastal area, but towards the wilderness side as well. Maybe it wasn't developed then, Kevin. I don't know. And even though the rabbi said that we may not raise small domesticated animals in Eretz Israel, we may, however, raise large domesticated animals there. Now, guys, you remember the reason, because the rabbis do not enact a decree upon the public that, as you know, does what? Does what, guys?
But sorry, what's the question again?
Why
Decrees are enacted on the public.
Yeah, in other words, there's a why was there no prohibition to raise large animals in Eretz Israel? We only have a issue with small domesticated animals.
Because on the way, is the ox considered a large animal? Because
believe me, yes.
But then they can use it for food and for korbanot also, maybe.
Okay, so the reason was pretty simple, is because
I know why.
Yeah, tell me, mate.
Wasn't it because of animals going to the neighbor's yard? Also to do with the chickens picking up, let's say, ferrets or lizards that are bringing into the house. All that.
Okay, so you've definitely cottoned on to some of the answers, just not in relation to this particular question.
Oh, sorry. Okay.
But at least you heard some of it. So what we're saying, Kevin, is that your ox, your donkeys, any major big animal, the rabbis wouldn't enact prevention of that, because small animals like sheep and goats, you're able to import in quickly because the size is small and there are no logistical or transportation issues, and they were mainly used for food. Okay, so that was easy to import, but to import an animal like an ox or a donkey into the country would be enormously cumbersome and expensive, and therefore the rabbis don't decree something where the public cannot sustain and keep it. So large domesticated animals, one still had to be careful to prevent them from eating in your neighbor's pasture or any other Jew's pasture, as far as that's concerned. And also, small domesticated animals could only be imported up to 30 days before a event, whether it was a simcha or one of the chagim. Okay, so while it's possible to bring small animals to Eretz Israel from abroad as needed, the Gemara says it's not possible to bring large animals from abroad as needed. And by the way, you needed bigger animals there because they weren't just a source of food. They were a source of transport and working animals, at which you couldn't do without. You know, you'd need an ox to plow the land. There wasn't the tractor with diesel back in the day. Okay. So the brisa now delineates the procedure for importing small animals, even though the rabbi said that we may not raise small domesticated animals in Eretz Israel. One may, however, detain them for up to 30 days prior to the festival or function, or 30 days, for example, prior to his son's wedding feast, provided that he does not tame the last one 30 days after its purchase. What do we mean? That if you bought the animal in 6 days, the last set of animals 6 days before the wedding, you can't say, well, it's 30 days from hence, because everybody will invent a function, a wedding. They're buying it for their cousin's wedding, and then the whole thing will fall apart. So you have to slaughter it you have to stipulate what function it is you're bringing the animals for, and there has to be evidence that you've slaughtered the animal and it's now going to go in Tupperware. And you don't want it to spoil, so you're not going to import more than needed. There was no refrigeration in those days. The reason why you couldn't have 30 days from when you imported it over and above the function date is because people would just abuse the system and say, oh, you know that bar mitzvah down in Sydenham Shul? Yeah, I'm sponsoring that. My 30 days isn't up. So clearly it has to be by that stipulated function. So the Gemara interrupts this discussion and it says there has to be a necessity for the last proviso. So it says, for if it may enter your mind to say that if the festival departed today, and from when he purchased the last animal until now, its 30 days have not yet been filled, he may retain the animal even after the festival until the 30 days is complete. If it's saying, if that's what you think, the notion is refuted because the Brisa teaches expressly that we shall not say that a full 30 days one is unconditionally permitted to retain the animal. Rather, once the festival or function has departed, he should not retain it. Okay. Then we went into this issue that the Gemara resumed the discussion and it says, well, how are you going to get your meat? So then the discussion was, we go to our local butcher. But the same laws apply to the butcher. So the butcher can purchase small animals and slaughter them immediately. That's your one option. Or alternatively, he may purchase and detain them for up to 30 days prior to market day. So his specific chag or function would be market day. Now, we said we didn't know if market day would be once a month, but that's highly unlikely for the simple reason that people would need to get fresh meat every week or maybe twice a week because there was no refrigeration. But as long as the animal was brought in 30 days before, it had to be shechted by that market day, unless there was going to be a shortage, at which you would maybe do it to the next market day. But the Gemara corrects that and says no. Providing that he does not detain the belated one among them 30 days, rather he must slaughter all his animals by market day. So I'm assuming that market day was probably once a week, guys, but it's just a guess. Now, Gavin asked an excellent question, and he said, well, listen, what happens if you're having issues with your neighbor, and then you're sitting in a very, very difficult position where your neighbors are just not supplying any animals until you pay their ridiculous price, or they may be at war with you and want to starve you out. So there were different halachas in history. As Gavin said, it was a surprise. We've learned all this time is halachas of sheep and goats. So how could you keep them if you were prevented to by this Mishnah? We learned up until now there's a whole lot of halachas. So the answer is as follows, is that there are different periods of time in Jewish histories. The ideal state is rather than have contraception and sex where a condom could break and one could be HIV positive or get you check up the spout. The solution is no premarital sex. So that's first prize, but then it doesn't work sometimes because, you know, people are people. So the thing of it is the ideal situation is not to create any sort of circumstance where your animal would damage your neighbor's property or consume his land. And Gavin's right, there is an issue because otherwise why would we have the laws of shame? So that was first prize. It didn't always work. The second thing of it is you have to then have the animals either locked up where they fed in stables or they fed in pens or they secluded by fencing. That's second prize. The other option is to have the shepherds to look after the animal. But this was the ideal situation in times when your neighbors were reasonable. Now, how long is an Arab reasonable for? Well, about as short as a fuse in a dynamite stick. So we don't know. We don't know. But we do know that they were so greedy. And therefore, what would have happened is they wouldn't have messed up their ability to earn a living, because the perfect question that Arthur and Kevin would state is that they do sell oil and petrol in Israel. They just don't sell it at the cheapest price possible. Still cheaper than South Africa. But the thing of it is neighbors are there to make money. That's it. Even if they can't stand the neighbors. You know, personal feelings get put aside when cash is on the table. So that's what happens. And if you make the price too high, the market won't buy. The only exception is kosher restaurants in Johannesburg, that offer a terrible service, overcooked food, tiny portions, and people still come back and order more. This I don't get, and Gavin can testify to this, is that it's pretty disgusting. It's pretty disgusting that they take advantage of their own. So the thing of it is, there always was a balance where the rabbis would have a contingency plan in case the neighbors got cute and try to keep the prices as high as possible. So Gavin's completely right with this question, and that's for, we do learn the principles of shame, but this was done for another reason. And that reason was Yeshua wanted to attract people to live in the land of Israel. And therefore it was done as a method of saying, listen, here are their laws to protect you, where your fields are not going to be damaged, because the goats and the sheep that cause the most amount of damage, because they you import a volume of it. If you're consuming it, it's not, you don't want to kill Betsy the cow. You took a year to train the dumb animal to work for you. You're not going to slaughter it until its life expectancy is up. Whereas sheep and goats are very prolific and they're more likely to create damage. Not everybody hires the correct sort of shepherd. So therefore, one of the incentives of coming to Eretz Israel was the fact that your land would not be eaten by sheep and goats. So it was an incentive, Gavin, to allow people to make aliyah from over the lands, like Babylon, etc. Are you with me? Like Bavli. So we learn in this next section about Rabban Gamliel, who was asked by his students, what is the law regarding whether it's permitted to raise small domesticated animals in Eretz Israel? Which is exactly what Gavin asked. He said to them, it's permitted. So the Gemara obviously reacted in astonishment, because we learned in this Mishnah, we may not raise small animals in the land of Israel, and this is a unanimous Mishnaic teaching, which means Rebbe, who basically developed this Mishnah, would not go against Rabban Gamliel, who ran the Sanhedrin for that generation. So why would the two be contradictory? So the Gemara amends the question and answers, rather the students inquired thus of Rabban Gamliel, what is the law regarding whether one is permitted to detain a small animal in one's house, even for longer than 30 days, and even not for a festival in need? To me, it seems like the same sort of cheeky question, to be honest. So that was the way that Rashba understood it, and Rashi explained it. Tosfot isn't happy. Tosfot and other Rishonim say the students were asking whether it's permitted to detain a small animal for up to 30 days prior to the festival. So in other words, according to Tosfot's explanation, it's saying, okay, since there's this restriction, how do you make sure the animal doesn't damage within that 30-day period? According to the first explanation of Rashi, it's saying, well, how do we keep it out of the, how do we keep it longer than 30 days? And how do we keep it where it doesn't have to be killed for the festival itself? So it's saying, like, how do you push the law? Are you allowed to? So according to both versions, Rabban Gamliel said it's permitted, but obviously under certain conditions. What are those conditions? Provided that the animal does not go out and graze with these herds, rather the animal is tied to the legs of the bed. So what we said is that before you panic and say, how can you keep an animal tied to your bed? It's a euphemism. What it's saying is, if you don't keep it inside the house, you need to keep it in a stable or a barn or an animal pen, but locked up. And the rabbis dispute Rabban Gamliel's ruling, because they say you may not detain a small animal at all in the absence of a special occasion, and then only for 30 days. And on top of that, it has to be securely bound. That's a given. That's absolutely a given. So the Gemara relates a related episode, because they're saying, listen, this is a very serious transgression. So there was once a man who was very, very pious. Now, whenever the Gemara refers to a pious man, it discusses in Tamura on the 15th daf that it's talking about Rav Yehuda ben Bava. Okay, so obviously Rav Yehuda ben Bava was a very sickly man, and he'd grown from the pain from his heart, for which he found no relief. Apparently he had a heart condition. So his intimates asked the doctor what to do. When we say his intimates, it was probably his wife and his children, what we would call your closest of kin and friends. Okay, they asked him what to do. So what happens is the doctor said that, listen, there's no remedy for him unless he suckles hot, fresh milk from a live animal every morning. Now, before you think there's some sort of a fetish going on, I can assure you that wasn't the case. He's not grabbing the tit of the animal and starting to suck. It's not that. They tie the animal to the bed, and because he can't move because of his heart condition, he can reach out, grab the animal by its leash or its collar, and then milk the animal into a cup. He's not exactly going direct from breast, don't worry. So what's happening is he has to have like super fresh milk. Why? Because there was something about the hot milk that was a remedy for him. Okay? And they brought for the sick man a goat and tied its legs to the bed. Now, you might say, well, is it cruel to the animal? So we're not animal rights activists. If it comes to saving a human or saving an animal, we save a human first. I don't know, there's not even a question as far as that's concerned. So they tied it to the legs of the bed, meaning that it would not escape by its collar, whatever the case may be. And he would drink from the milk every morning, and after several days, the pious scholars and colleagues, in other words, not his closest family, they've entered the house to visit him, because he was obviously one of the leaders of the generation. But once they saw that the goat was tied to the legs of the bed, they backed out of the house and exclaimed, armed robbers are in the house of this man, and should we visit him? So what does it mean, armed robbers are in the house? Is that it was meant that basically anybody that would be in violation of the rabbinical decree and allows a goat to be kept without there being a festival and without that 30-day limitation within that festival is known as a robber, and thereby steals from the community. That's Rashi's explanation. The other explanation is that such a great man would not do that, so obviously robbers were in the house and were busy ransacking the place. In the meantime, tied their animal to the bed while they were busy ransacking the house. So that could be the only two explanations. They say this is not the behavior of a pious man. And their question was, well, should we even visit him if he's not pious? Because they said he's unworthy of our concern. So basically, these great rabbis examined his deeds of their sick colleague, and they said they found him to be absolutely free of sin, except this sin of harboring that goat. And even at the time of his death, he said, I know that I have no sin but the sin of keeping that goat, whereby I transgressed the ruling of my colleagues. So what we're saying is that, firstly, towards the end of his life, just before his death, after a person does a video service, which is like Yom Kippur, a confession service. So the pious scholar was able to recall that his only major transgression, or transgression at all, was breaking that rabbinical edict against detaining small domesticated animals for personal purposes. So the commentators asked, but hang on a second, surely to save a person's life, you can even violate a biblical prohibition. Give me an example, Kevin, as you know.
Just say, biblical, like if someone's ill, you can take them to drive them to the hospital on Shabbat.
Exactly. So they're saying, what is this problem here? Because this is a rabbinical decree. What do you mean you can't break it in order to save the man's life since he was so sickly? Surely you could do such a thing. So if you can break a biblical decree to save somebody's life, surely you can break a rabbinical decree which is less severe, because he needed it to recover his health. So the Meiri answers that when the law was broken, it exists Firstly, he wasn't deathly ill at the time. He was very sick, but he wasn't deathly ill, and therefore should not have given himself the dispensation to violate the restriction of his colleagues. That's number one. And number two is that there are opinions that the rabbinical enactment to prevent communal losses should be exceedingly stringent about violating it, even more than a biblical. For example, if you're breaking Shabbos, you're breaking Hashem's law. And Hashem understands a person to do it in order to save your life. But are you allowed to damage somebody else in order to save yourself? Well, we know one of the three cardinal sins about which you meant to give up your life rather than do is what, Arthur?
I have no idea.
One of the three, or all three.
Well, okay, so Arthur says in Sanhedrin, there are three things that a person has to give up their life rather than transgress. Okay?
Okay.
That is, you cannot take the life of another, because who's to say whose blood is redder? So they use the example of a Talmud Chacham. You've got the leader of a generation and a teenage drug addict. There would be no question as to the fact that the leader of the generation would seem to his life be more valuable than the other. Okay? That would seem to be the case. But if the Talmud Chacham had to take this teenage drug addict's life in order to save his life, he's not allowed to do it, because we don't know what a person's destiny is. Maybe that drug addict gets some hippie girl pregnant and ends up having a child that cures cancer. We don't know. We don't know. So therefore, one has to give what it says, whose blood is redder, meaning nobody can say their blood is red or more important than another. So one gives up their life rather than committing that cardinal sin. The second one where you give up your life rather than committing a cardinal sin is idolatry, because that is a chilul Hashem. You're not allowed to desecrate Hashem's name to save one's life. Okay? But breaking Shabbos, the reason you're allowed to break Shabbos is because in order that you can keep another Shabbos. In other words, it's not a desecration of Hashem's name. And in fact, if the situation was not to get healthcare as an emergency, but some non-Jew says in public, you have to break Shabbos in order to save your life, you can't do it. It even says you can't even break a minhag for something for a chilul Hashem, if it makes a mockery to the Jewish people. Kevin, one last thing is that one's meant to give up their life rather than committing sexual immorality, because you're not only damaging yourself, but you're damaging somebody else's soul. So, for example, incest, where somebody would get the death penalty, you obviously can't commit that incest, because you'd have to give up your life anyway, so you might as well give up your life without the sin. So here, the rabbinical enactment means, okay, I put you on mute off just because of the hee-haw from the donkey of the machine in the background. So what we're saying is here, the rabbinical decree is that you're causing damage to your neighbors. Can you do that? And it's not taken so lightly, that rabbinical decree, because you're damaging others. It's not a decision at which you're only damaging yourself. So that's why it was such a serious violation. So, and he wasn't at death's door. So those were the two things that the Meiri brought in terms of a commentary. Okay? So basically, in hindsight, he regretted doing that. Okay, Kevin, you're falling asleep. Your eyes are dilated, which is no problem.
For 1 second, just 1 second.
Okay. All right. So, guys, the Gemara reveals the dire consequences of even a minor infraction relating to raising sheep and goats in Eretz Israel. Okay? You learned that. So it's going to bring another case. Rabbi Yishmael from the homesteaders of the Upper Galilee were my father's family. In other words, his ancestors were amongst the great sages of that particular region. And why were they destroyed? Why were his ancestors destroyed, Rav Yishmael? Well, quite simply, because they would graze their small animals in the forest, and adjudicate financial matters single-handedly. And even though they had forests next to their houses, a small field belonging to others was lying between their houses and the forest, and they would pass through it with the animals to reach the forest. So let me just break up that statement and explain to you what I mean. Okay? Is that the first thing it's trying to say is, if you think the ramifications were severe in the previous case, look at this particular case. Rabbi Ishmael lost his ancestors, and they were very, very great men. How great were they? Is that they could adjudicate financial matters single-handedly. What do we mean? Is, guys, although an expert judge on the Beis Din is empowered to adjudicate financial cases by himself, it was in the 5th daf of Sanhedrin and taught us that, Gavin. It's appropriate that one refrain from doing so until he gains a reputation of being such an expert. Okay? So generally you need 3 judges in a financial matter, but we're talking obviously that these were leaders of the generation like we can't believe. So if they were on that spiritual level, they were judged much more stringently. And even though they had forests next to their houses, in other words, Rav Yishmael's ancestors certainly didn't do that crassness of allowing their sheep to graze in other people's fields. Rather, they took the animals immediately to the adjacent fallows, and they were allowed in that adjacent forest to let the animals eat there. It's not that they let them eat in their neighbors' fields, okay? And even in privately owned forests, Joshua enacted that the owners must allow neighbors to graze in their woods. So there wasn't any issue there. But the problem was, there was a small field belonging to others that was lying between their houses and the forest. And they would pass through it with the animals to reach the forest. In other words, they were punished for causing the owner of the field to likely suffer a financial loss, because even if the animals in all likelihood grazed a little bit, because they were still going to be taken to the forest on their way to the field, because they had to pass that field in order to get to the forest, that was enough to have them punished to the degree where their ancestors were destroyed on that basis, because they destroyed the vegetation of the neighbors. So that's how serious it was. Obviously, we're not judged by that sort of level today. Okay, so the Gemara basically prescribes a method to rectify 2 different violations of our Mishnah. So the rabbis taught in the Brisa, in the case of a shepherd who has repented, raising and pasturing his sheep and goats in the cultivated areas of Eretz Yisrael, we don't obligate him to sell all his animals immediately. Rather, he may sell them off little by little. So what are we talking about here? Is, guys, the guy was a secular guy. He didn't really give a damn about his neighbors. He wasn't that aware of the halacha. Whatever it was, he decided to do a teshuvah. So if we required him to sell his entire flock immediately, he's going to balk at the financial loss. He's not going to be able to withstand it. And therefore, because it's so significant in one go, he's going to fail to actualize his repentance on a deeply emotional level. He's going to resent it in some way. So rather, the rabbis enacted that he's allowed to sell off his animals gradually and continue to pasture the rest, taking care to prevent them from straying in other people's fields. So he has to make a kapara, but he can sell them off little by little when he realizes the halacha and the damage he does, so that he can do a proper teshuvah and not end up resenting it by the huge financial devastation immediately. In other words, he feels it slowly. But in the meantime, while he realizes that, he has to make sure the animals are well guarded and don't eat in the field of the neighbors. And similarly, guys, in the case of a convert, a proselyte, to whom dogs and swine fell into his inheritance, because we know, guys, that you can't raise dogs without a leash, nor you can't raise any sort of pigs or swine in Eretz Yisrael. So we say we don't obligate him to sell them immediately. So your question is, how would we allow a convert to keep swine anyway, since he's become halachically Jewish, or to raise dogs without a leash. I mean, we wouldn't allow such a thing. So how does that situation come up? Because basically a convert has the legal status of a newborn child, and therefore he's totally shorn of any legal ties to his biological king. So, but if his father, for example, left him an inheritance of a whole lot of pigs, we don't want him to lose money. So he may inherit them, because otherwise he's going to end up saying, stuff this, I don't want to be Jewish anymore, I don't want to lose money, I'm quite happy to go back to my old ways. Then, unfortunately, he's converted and it's too late. So we say, hang on a second, let him keep the animals for a certain period of time and get rid of them within a certain period, so he doesn't suffer losses and he can get the money for the animals. And that was brought up in the 17th Daf of Kedushin. So therefore, he's still going to remain Jewish. So we're talking about, the Bryce is speaking about a convert who inherited dogs and swine from his biological kin, and they weren't forbidden to raise those species. So we say that in that particular case, we don't want him to suffer a huge financial loss by selling the animals immediately in one go at a loss. Do you get what I'm saying? Because the thing of it is, we learned before in a daf, if somebody is having financial hardships, then unfortunately people will take advantage of it. Just like when somebody knows that, when the community knows somebody's immigrating, they want to buy the stuff for next to nothing, because they know he has to leave the country quickly, Kevin. So people take advantage. So we're saying we're going to allow this Jewish convert who's inherited these animals he can't keep to get rid of them over a certain period of time, so he doesn't throw off his Judaism. Now, similarly, in the case of one who vowed to acquire a house and to acquire a wife in the land of Eretz Yisrael, we don't obligate him to acquire these things immediately, because what he's basically saying is that he wanted to marry a wife in Eretz Yisrael and acquire a house there in order to live in the land of Israel, because he could have married a wife in Babylon. So if we tell him he has to fulfill his vow immediately, okay, then the problem is he might not be able to afford marrying and settling in Eretz Yisrael, and if the Beis Din had to compel him to do so, and to fulfill those vows precipitously, then he would feel so angry at having been forced into a situation, and that vow, where he did out of love for Eretz Yisrael to do a praiseworthy practice and mitzvah, he would come to resent. So what's happening is that we say that we don't obligate him to acquire these things immediately, but rather put in a sort of plan or a strategy, and he can deliberate until he finds the appropriate one for him. Meaning, in that case, the man vowed to perform certain mitzvahs, so he wanted to marry and settle in Eretz Yisrael. So we basically say that he can do it slowly, because we don't want him to get divorced in 2 minutes by marrying some crazy lady there, nor buying a property when he can't afford to, as long as he doesn't make a date to his vow, but rather say, listen, this is my intention, and not word it as a vow. And then we're going to conclude with one incident, and we've got 3 minutes left, is that the Brisa concludes with a related incident. And there was once an incident involving a certain woman. She was either a widow or divorcee whose son was causing her distress. So she wanted to escape her predicament, and she hastened and swore, says, whoever comes first and proposes marriage to me, I shan't turn him away. And subsequently, men who were not suitable for her heard about this declaration she made, and they all offered her marriage. And when the matter came to the attention of the sages, they say, this woman actually can get out of it. Why? Because she only intended to marry somebody that's really suitable for her. She was desperate because her kids was causing her no end of hassles. Maybe she couldn't afford to sustain him on his own. Maybe it was very difficult. But in other words, she was saying, listen, she just wants a suitable person, but she's not being overly fussy, but she doesn't need somebody that's mentally ill. or somebody that's impoverished. That's just going to add to her problems. So the rabbis didn't consider it a vow that she must marry this person. So to somebody looking to live in Eretz Israel, they realized it was situational, and actually just said that you don't have to marry the first person you see or do it by deadline. Otherwise, you'll come to resent it. All right, guys, we're going to end off on that note. It's very clear. I simplified everything reasonably well. We covered reasonable ground.
Well done.
All right, cool. Tomorrow
this is page 80 still. Damon's still 79, or is it page 80?
No. We're on the 80th daf, and tomorrow.
But it's near the end of the book. You know that there's only about 3 or 4 more daf left, and then it's the end of the second volume.
Exactly. We nearly finished, but we still have to talk about bush weasels, which will be tomorrow.
So then, yes.